Yeah, Mets Magic was on full display Tuesday night. They came back from down four to get the dub against the Orioles. It's their biggest comeback of the season. Michael Barron of Just Mets is on to talk the state of Mets baseball heading into the All-Star break and the trade deadline. Michael, thanks for hopping on with this, man. In the title, I forgot to say he's an awesome guy as well, man. Your headline, let's get straight into this because the headline to your newsletter I was reading earlier, the article says, or the headline says, money came up money as the Mets earned their biggest comeback win in 2025. Steve Cohen called Lindor, Alonso, Soto, and Diaz the Fab Four. They all played a big role in the comeback win. But billion-dollar question here, though, Mike. Is this Fab Four enough to lead this team to a World Series appearance?
I don't think there's any question they need help at the bottom of the lineup. The 6 through 9, no matter how Carlos Mendoza slices it on a daily basis, it always seems to be an abyss. They have four positions at a sub 660 OPS, and they just need help. Um, Mark Vientos hasn't helped the situation because he's underperformed, coming off a big year last year. And I think that's really what's created the hole for them. But they're also not getting anything out of center field, and obviously the catching situation has been a struggle since day one. So I think they're going to have to go out at the trade deadline and find. An, I think they need to find an impact bat, but that doesn't mean that's necessarily going to happen. David Stearns, last year improved on the margins and it seemed to help, but I still think they need to get a well-rounded player for one of the two positions in the field, that being third base or center field.
All right, before we get into talking about the trade deadline and the impact back, a guy whose bat had an impact last night was Juan Soto. He hit in the tenth inning. He drove in that go-ahead run that we saw. NL Player of the Month in June, and now he comes up big in a high-pressure moment after being snubbed off the All-Star roster. So, two-part question: one, in your opinion, was he snubbed? And two, do you think that disrespect kind of woke up the beast?
Well, I think he definitely deserves to be an all-star, and I think when I saw the results come out the other night, my first thought was that's just a total snub, right? But the first 2 months of his season where he was slumping or really, just he was struggling to get on track. I think that didn't help, and it reminded me of what Francisco Lindor went through last year when by the time All-Star came around, he looked like an all-star, but the first 2 months may have hindered his ability to be on the team. But, you know, did that wake him up? I mean, he has almost a 1200 OPS over the last month or so of play, and he looks like the Juan Soto the Mets signed, and he's must watch. He's been must watch TV pretty much for that entire span. And yesterday he was a huge part of that rally. Between his game-winning RBI in the 10th inning, he helped get things started in the 8th inning for them. And this is the guy they signed. I don't know that not being on the All-Star team, changes. Changes his credentials or reduces his value. I mean, and he could still very well be there depending on whether or not he's an injury replacement or something like that. So but he's just amazing, and I'm just glad he's on the Mets at this point.
All right, let's talk about the trade deadline now because Clay Holmes struggled over 5 innings and he got roughed up in the fifth when he allowed 4 runs. But
Yeah.
the Mets bullpen kind of stepped in and allowed just 1 run over the final 5 innings of the game. I know the starting rotation is waiting to get some of these guys back healthy, but should bringing in another starter be the main focus of the trade deadline or impact bat? Which is more important?
It's a good question because I think things started to spiral for this club when the starting pitching went south, when Kodai Senga got hurt about a month ago, and that's when things just got out of just tailspin for them. And it all starts on the mound because how many crooked numbers, how many games with crooked numbers have they had, including last night, which they overcame. But when you give up crooked numbers, it's hard to the offensive approach changes. Every at bat becomes um, a high pressure situation. And so it's different than when you're playing ahead. So I do think they need to prioritize the pitching staff. whether that's a big arm in the bullpen or the starting rotation. I think Mitch Keller should be a top target for them. He seems to check all the boxes for them. It's a contract they can absorb, and that's just one example. The Mets are in a position, always in a position to take on money, whereas other teams may be reluctant to do that. So it seems like a good fit on paper. But they also need, and David Stearns has talked about this a lot, they need to find a left-handed reliever for the bullpen. They've missed AJ Minter in a big way. And that's where I think they're going to go in the bullpen. Um, but at the same time, I just mentioned the 6 through 9 in the lineup and having four positions with a sub 660 OPS. And you saw yesterday, like it was a trial getting through that part of the lineup. So I think the needs are equal. I think that's how I would term it. I don't think one need outweighs the other. I think they need both. I think they need a bat. I think they need pitching.
All right, as we get closer to the All-Star break, after the Mets had a horrible stretch on the back half of the month of June, they're now tied with the Phillies for first place in
Yeah.
the NL East. We've seen this team hit all kinds of highs and lows. So, what would be your midseason grade for the Mets so far, and why?
I'd say they're an A. They're in first place. They're among the best teams in baseball, and they've been among the best teams in one of the best teams in baseball the entire year, despite the June swoon that they just went through. Um, I think, Clay Holmes has been a pleasant surprise despite he's had some regression, presumably because of the innings that he's reached. Edwin Diaz has been obviously amazing since the end of April. And, the 1 through 4 in the lineup, that's really hard to replicate too. Like they're one of three teams that have four players with 50 RBIs, that have 50 or more RBIs. So, I think the team gets an A. That doesn't mean there aren't holes, there aren't things they need to improve upon, but I have every bit of faith they will. And I also think that getting some of these starting pitchers back into the rotation is going to help improve their pitching as well, in addition to whatever they do ahead of July 31st.
All right, Michael Barron, thanks for hopping on with me, man.